What does Gandhi, Mussolini, and President Wilson have in common? Montessori. A charismatic scientist who was the first woman to receive her doctorate and a medical license in Italy, she corresponded with Freud, was embroiled in the Spanish Civil War, and was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Leaders around the world were impressed by her educational system, but they were more interested in how to use it to their advantage. Why? What is it about Montessori that caught their attention? To find out, we need to go back a bit. The year is 1870. Italy is a mess. For the last 100 years, the country of Italy was actually a large group of city-states, the majority of which was governed by foreign powers, not to mention the papal states that were controlled by the Pope. The people of Italy went through several complicated revolutions until October of 1870, when the King of Italy invaded Rome, finally uniting the country. What else is so special about the year of 1870? It is the year that Maria Tecla Artemisia Montessori was born in the city of Cervali, which is gorgeous, and one day I will go. The land was rich in history and classical thinking, but the country of Italy itself was not even a year old and had been in a state of unrest for decades. Another thing special about 1870? Industrial Revolution, kids! Okay, so Italy is a little late to the game, but they made up for it in enthusiasm. The new Italian government became intent on building canals, roads, railways, which meant they needed engineers. Lots of engineers. Montessori grew up in the midst of this reinvention of her country. She became determined to become an engineer, and at her mother's encouragement and her father's dismay, Montessori enrolled in the technical school for engineering and graduated in 1889 with a degree in physics and mathematics. By the time of her graduation, she had lost her enthusiasm for engineering. She applied to the University of Rome in 1890 to become a doctor. She was denied. Admitting a woman to the Doctorate of Medicine program was not only unprecedented, it was unthinkable. The story goes that she had to appeal to the Pope for his intervention. She's quoted as saying, "The Holy Father gave it at his opinion that medicine was a profession preeminently suited for women and one which they should take up." That changed matters considerably. The University of Rome at this time was still heavily regulated by the government, and faculty were forced to be more concerned about reaching the government requirements than actually facilitating learning. The university itself existed primarily to administer tests. Sounds depressingly familiar. Montessori persevered, and in 1896, Montessori graduated as a Doctor of Medicine. Montessori was victorious, but not finished. Not by a long shot. Up to this point, Montessori's education had been rigorous, but unimaginative. Class structures were filled with drills and endless memorization. She had been constantly roadblocked because of her gender, and schools were catering to a bureaucracy instead of how students actually learn. She was dissatisfied. After graduation, she continued research work at the psychiatric clinic and began to regularly visit Rome's asylums for the insane. Children who were not able to function in their families or school were interred among adults in these asylums. They were locked up with catatonics, criminally insane, and every form of human misery imaginable because of the lack of social funds. As a scientist and now a doctor of medicine, she determined that these children's minds were not useless, they were just unused. She began furious research on mentally ill children and if it would be possible to educate them. A moment of real clarity came when she observed a young girl trying to darn a sock. She offered her a paper weaving mat. After the girl mastered threading strips of paper, she was again offered a needle and was able to darn the sock easily. Montessori exulted. We should really find the way to teach the child how before making him execute a task. To teach a skill was not to have a child repeatedly try to do it, it was to practice an exercise that prepares him for it. With that in mind, she offered wooden letters the children could handle and manipulate, which eventually led them to writing and reading sounds. She presented several of the 8-year-olds for the state examinations, and they passed easily, doing as well or better than their peers outside of the asylum. Her reaction? What does that say about our education system? And what would happen if these same methods were used in a classroom? During the 1880s and 90s, Rome faced increasing struggles with housing. There was a boom of heavy growth and a rise in apartment buildings. Bank speculation grew alongside it, and credit crashed hard. It's really rather sad how we keep repeating ourselves. This led to an unfinished, empty apartment buildings throughout the city, which were eventually invaded by squatters. In an attempt to address the growing crime, a group of men bought one of the buildings and refitted it into smaller apartments for poor working families. Among the families who moved in were about 50 children. During their day, their parents went to work and the preschool-aged children ran wild. Montessori was asked if she would be willing to undertake the organization and management of the children. An accomplished doctor and applauded scientist, especially after the miracle of the asylum children, many were surprised when she accepted. But Montessori saw an opportunity. This became known as the Casa dei Bambini. Montessori brought the same materials that she used with the children in the asylum and began to make meticulous observations. Not only did the children become proficient at manipulating the materials, they began to learn from them with little to no teaching. The school was such a success that it attracted visitors from around the world. They were surprised to see such young children reading and writing, and they would ask, "Who taught you how to read and write?" "Taught? Nobody taught me. I taught myself." More schools in poor parts of town began to open, and Montessori was inundated by requests to learn about her method. She began to tour across Europe, giving lectures on how to teach the whole child from younger ages than was thought possible. The essential piece of Montessori's education, which was so radical from the schools of the time, was that the child does not mold itself to school with its arbitrary tasks and endless drilling, but that the school molds itself to the child. What I find fascinating about this is what it reveals about Montessori herself. Self-controlled, competent, independent. She was a woman in the Victorian age who learned at every stage of her life how to do what she wanted to do for herself. With this increasing interest in her method, Montessori grew alarmed that her methods would be misused. She decided anyone who wished to teach a Montessori class must be trained by Montessori herself. She worried about imitators and manufacturers taking advantage in order to make a buck. In short, she was worried about the commercialism of Montessori method. Which means it's time to visit America. Montessori was here to shake up education. 1913 is a year that holds its breath. Ford Motors Company has already been around for 10 years, the result being the U.S. was well into the age of the automobile, and women were campaigning across the U.S. to vote. The West was won, the telephone was connecting families coast to coast, and John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust dominated the world market. She traveled across the U.S. on a 3-week lecture tour. At a reception in Washington, D.C., Margaret Wilson, President Wilson's daughter, took her sightseeing and arranged for her to meet a number of influential government figures. Everywhere she went, she was met with loud crowds and standing ovations. It would be the height of enthusiasm for Montessori method in the United States. Which makes what happened kind of inevitable. Admirers of the Montessori method began to produce her Montessori materials on a mass scale. Books were published explaining the Montessori method. Advocates for Montessori began to travel and train others for Montessori schools. And in her mind, Montessori's method was being exploited for profit. She continued to insist that only she could train teachers and wanted complete control of the manufacture, distribution, and use of the materials made for Montessori schools. The result being that her admirers felt snubbed, and it kind of built resentment. On top of this, detractors and skeptics emerged. Children out of the home by the tender age of 3 was ridiculous. It looked like a social control and an un-American attack on the institution of the family. The supposed lack of free play and the elimination of stories and imagination further alienated Americans who up to this point had been enamored with the possibilities of Froebel's kindergarten. This led to a decline in interest, and it would be many years after her death before Montessori method gained similar traction. Montessori returned to Europe, and shortly thereafter, World War I began. Understandably, the war slowed the growth of Montessori schools, but it was during this time that the real benefit of Montessori's method was discovered. It began with a remarkable woman named Mary Cromwell. A New York heiress, Mary had trained with Montessori and then dedicated her life and fortune to the children of France. When war broke out, she began working with shell-shocked refugee Belgian and French children. Cromwell described the children as numb and unresponsive. A sort of stupor invaded them and rendered them for a long time incapable of interest in anything. When Montessori visited Mary Cromwell's school, she was moved. More than that, she saw how her method, especially the practical life exercises, worked in healing their mental trauma. Like in her other schools, the little refugee children would sweep the classroom, weed gardens, and feed animals. These motor skills helped the body and brain to work together. It brought order not only to the classroom, but helped self-regulate and calm the minds of the children. What modern research tells us now, something Montessori observed, is that acute trauma can be healed in part by participating in activities that are repetitive and rhythmic. This ultimately reduces anxiety and other trauma-related symptoms. It was nothing short of miraculous. Montessori also felt something amazing in Mary Cromwell's schools. Early childhood education was an opportunity for peace. Children, particularly those affected by war, deserved a peace-focused education. And for the rest of her life, she would become a peace advocate for children. So naturally, this would be where our villain enters.
Fisico nella cornice del foro Mussolini.
In 1924, she was invited to meet with Italy's new Prime Minister, Mussolini. Mussolini's interest in Montessori schools stemmed from the idea of control and order. There was also the added benefit of using Montessori's world-renowned name to legitimize his fascist regime internationally. A Montessori society was opened in which Mussolini became an honorary president. Montessori believed education, perhaps naively, transcended politics, and she enjoyed the support of the fascist government.
È un privilegio che vi impone dei particolari doveri.
But ultimately, Mussolini and Montessori were on different trajectories. It came to a head at her refusal to force her teachers to take the fascist loyalty oath. The Italian government very quickly began closing down her schools, and Montessori was forced to leave in exile to the Netherlands. Montessori didn't know what Mussolini was until it was impossible not to, and I don't think this reflects badly on her. In fact, I think it shows a true force of character because she refused to bend, even with the added pressure of working with somebody who had, for a short time at least, promoted her work. In 1931, Montessori was invited to train teachers in London and hosted a roundtable for Montessori followers. Among those who came was Mahatma Gandhi. The two met and discussed peace and education. She made such an impression on him that he made a special visit to Rome to see her schools. When Montessori came to India in 1939, just as World War II began, he was one of the first to welcome her. In India, Montessori led training courses and visited schools already established. But when Italy joined the war in 1940, Montessori was essentially put under house arrest. And while her movements were restricted, it did not stop her continued research in child development or peace-driven education. During the years she spent in India, it reinforced her idea that education can be the means of breaking down barriers that separate social groups. Brahmins and untouchables lived harmoniously together during the months they spent training with Montessori, confirming that education is an effective tool for peace. Montessori is remarkable in that she refused to be controlled by governments, dictators, or opportunists. The legacy of Montessori is astonishing in that it has aged so well. Things that she had observed in children in the early 1900s still ripples through child development and modern education today. Montessori continued a fast-paced life of tours and lectures until her death at 81. So I just did a deep dive in Montessori because I was interested to find how her life corresponded with her method and the development of it, and it absolutely does. In fact, you can pin pinnacle moments of her life and how it reflects in how she teaches and how her method is applied. And I found it super fascinating. So I'm going to be releasing a couple of videos every once in a while about the Montessori method. So if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do so you can keep an eye out for that.